Good evening and welcome to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I'm David Innes, one of the trustees, and I'm delighted to be able to start with thanking once again EP Barras Limited, the Bicester engineering firm, for their sponsorship of tonight's talk. This is the second time Barras have supported in this way, and it is a wonderful thing for us to be so considered by them. Alan Wakefield's talk tonight is important to us and relevant to the county of Oxfordshire because two service battalions of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, the county infantry regiment, fought in the Salonika campaign during the Great War against a most determined Bulgarian enemy and took heavy casualties during this largely unknown campaign. Alan is the authority, a published authority, on the history of this campaign. He is also head of the First World War and 20th Century team at the Imperial War Museum, and we are most grateful to him for his efforts on our behalf. The port of Salonika, which he refers to early in his talk, is of course modern-day Thessaloniki in the northwest corner of the Aegean Sea. We don't charge for our talks, you know that, but we are most grateful if you are able to make a donation to us for the efforts that have gone into making tonight's talk possible. So if you're inclined that way, don't hold back and encourage others sitting around you to do the same, please. We'd really appreciate that. Thank you very much. After the talk, there'll be a live question and answer session with Alan, the speaker, and that will follow immediately. Please stay with us for that.
It's wonderful to be here at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum today to give a talk on the Salonika campaign. This is very much a forgotten campaign of the British Army in the First World War, and this talk will try to shed some light on experiences of frontline soldiers in the British Salonika force who served in northern Greece and southern Serbia between 1915 and 1918. The Salonika campaign was very much a sideshow of the First World War in terms of British service, and it's worth recapping probably why British troops were in Greece well before that nation actually joined the war. Anglo-French forces began to land at the port of Salonika on the 5th of October 1915, and the men landing had little idea that they were committing themselves to a 3-year campaign in a very obscure part of Europe. In the words of either Davis, a gunner with B Battery, 100 Brigade Royal Field Artillery.
There were many rumours going the rounds regarding our destination. No one thought of Salonika or the Balkan front. Not many knew that such a place existed. I certainly did not.
Now, the initial role of British and French forces was initially to deter Bulgaria from joining the Central Powers in an attack on Serbia. Bulgaria had declared general mobilisation on the 22nd of September 1915, and she'd already signed a secret convention pact with the Central Powers and had pledged to follow up any Austro-German attack on Serbia. Now, Bulgaria was looking to overturn her defeat in the Second Balkan War. In 1912-1913, there were two Balkan wars. Initially, the Greeks, Serbians, Bulgarians and Montenegrins ganged up on the Turks and more or less kicked the Turks out of Europe. But then the Balkan countries fell out amongst themselves over the spoils, and the Bulgarians, thinking they'd done the majority of the fighting, didn't get the territory they wanted and attacked Serbia. This led to an all-out attack on Bulgaria by Greece, Serbia, Romania, Montenegro and even Turkey, in which Bulgaria lost even more territory. So in 1915, Bulgaria was looking to join whichever side would give it the territory it thought was its due, and that is really what is today's state of North Macedonia. Of course, this was part of Serbia, so it's very difficult for the Allies to do this, but it was very easy for the Germans to offer them that territory and even more once Serbia had been defeated. So the initial Allied force to try to stop the Bulgarians entering the war was one British division and two French divisions from Gallipoli. They were off Gallipoli on Lemnos, and they could be moved out quickly. This was the only reason they were chosen, because they were the nearest available troops to go. They were quite weak in numbers, but they arrived in Greece. They were invited to land by the Greek pro-Allied Prime Minister, Venizelos. The big problem was, almost as soon as the British and French troops landed, Venizelos fell from power, and he had a big bust-up with the Greek government under King Constantine, and this began what was called the National Schism in Greece, which blighted Greek politics for decades afterwards. Obviously, when the British and French arrive, we've totally underestimated the Bulgarians. We think that just by turning up in Salonika, not actually having to do any fighting, the Bulgarians will not enter the war, but we've totally miscalculated this. 1915, the war is going pretty well for the Germans. Offensives on the Western Front have been stopped. The Russians have been stopped and pushed back. On the Eastern Front, Gallipoli has stalled, and it looks like this could be a point that Germany could win the war. So the Bulgarians are quite keen on getting involved at this point to come out on hopefully for them, the winning side. And British and French forces move north into southern Serbia, and then they're hit by Bulgarian forces, because by that time, December 1915, the Serbian army is already really defeated. What's happened is that in early October, Austrian and German forces come down north to south, attacking directly towards Belgrade, pushing the Serbian army into Kosovo. The Bulgarian army then swings round east to west, and the idea is to crush the Serbians. The Serbians have two options. They either go down in a battle of annihilation, as they did against the Turks in the medieval period, or they take the whole of their army, the government and whoever else can follow them, and they go over the mountains of Albania to the Adriatic coast and then are rescued by the Allies. And that's what they actually choose to do. So although Serbia is totally occupied, the Serbian army remains a force in being. They're taken to Corfu over 3 or 4 months in early 1916. They regroup, are rebuilt by the British and French, and then land at Salonika and join that Allied force. But in December 1915, it's looking very, very dubious that the Allies can actually remain in the Balkans. Serbia's been defeated, and the British, who are never over keen on being in the Balkans and around Salonika, want to leave. But unfortunately, we're fighting a coalition war, and the French, Italians and Russians, and of course the Serbs, all want us to remain in the Balkans. They've all got economic and political ties. And because it's a coalition, the British are tied in to fighting in what is now a neutral country, but a potentially hostile neutral country, because we've now got that government of King Constantine, which is basically more pro-German than pro-Allied. Now, because the British aren't particularly interested in this campaign, overall command on the Salonika front goes to the French. But the British commander has his usual recourse of back to the British government. This is the idea that if the French commander comes up with an idea which the British commander thinks is absolutely strategically crazy, he can get hold of London, he can get hold of the War Cabinet and the CIGS, and he can potentially get out of having to take part in that offensive action. But he's always under pressure to support their main ally, the French. So although it's initially General Marne, but then he's replaced by General Milne in May-June 1916, and Milne is always under pressure to support the French, but he does have this potential get-out clause. Now, the British Salonika force itself, if we look at its strength, at its height in late 1916, early 1917, it numbered around 228,000 military personnel. It was 2 corps, 12th and 16th Corps, each of 3 divisions, and the troops are a mixture of British Army regulars, territorials and New Army volunteers, and they're drawn from all over the British Isles and Ireland. The mounted troops are yeomanry, that's territorial cavalry, and cyclist units, and supporting them were the usual mix of the Royal Engineers, Army Service Corps, Royal Army Medical Corps, but there's also Maltese and Macedonian Labour battalions, Indian and Macedonian muleteers, and Canadian and voluntary medical formations such as the Scottish Women's Hospital. Air support is quite limited for the British. It's 2 squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps, number 17 and number 47. So that's 1 squadron per Army Corps on the front. Occasionally they borrow Royal Naval Air Service aircraft when there's a big threat from German bombers. But mostly it's those 2 squadrons, plus a kite balloon section as well for doing aerial observation work, mainly for artillery and mapping. But they're always short of artillery. And throughout the campaign, the Corps will always go out for more guns, especially howitzers, as these were particularly useful in the broken terrain of Macedonia. However, the low priority placed on the campaign by the War Office ensured that whatever arrived was always too little, too late. And a measure of the problems facing the British commander, General Milne, is evident from a letter that he wrote to CIGS Sir Henry Wilson in July 1918, and this is a quote from it about artillery.
I often wonder whether it's realised how small our requests are compared to the requirements of France. Here, another 8-inch howitzer battery would be a godsend, but would hardly be missed in France, while the amount of ammunition we ask for would probably be fired on the Western Front in a few hours. The other day I was refused 1 or 2 anti-aircraft guns, the receipt of which would have made a great difference to us, which I cannot imagine could not be spared.
So British troops started to converge on Salonika from quite a number of locations, initially Gallipoli, then Alexandria in Egypt, Marseille and Southampton. And before October 1917, the journey was done by troopship. And along with the cramped conditions, there was a threat of German and Austrian U-boats. And to go to some way to counter this menace of German and Austrian submarines, many troopships and cargo vessels were armed. But this could prove a very mixed blessing, as Second Lieutenant George Holderness of the 16th Corps Cyclists recalled.
Just after dawn on the second day out, the submarine alarm was sounded. We all dashed to our stations. Frantic shouts for the gun crew elicited the information that they had been left behind in port side. A Serbian staff major, an ex-gunner, said he would fire the gun. He did so. The old boat groaned and creaked ominously. A second shell was fired, nearer to the target this time, but it seemed to herald the end of the old cargo carrier, for she was so shaken that we feared she might split in 2. The Serbian officer was urged not to do any more firing. He agreed. On this occasion, the suspect U-boat conning tower turned out to be an empty beer barrel.
Now, in 1917, the U-boat campaign was really biting in the Atlantic, around the British coast and also in the Mediterranean. And to save on shipping, troops were sent between the UK and Salonika overland. What this actually meant was a very trying journey. Initially a train from Salonika down to a little town called Bralo. You would then get onto a lorry and go over the mountains of Thessaly to a small place called Itea on the Adriatic. You would then get on a ship and cross to Taranto in Italy, and then get onto an Italian train and go up through Italy, then get on a French train and go to the Channel ports, where you would finally get on a ship and reach the UK. And really, for this reason, many of the men don't go home on leave for the entirety of the campaign. Now, for the troops arriving in Salonika, their first sight of the city from the sea was a great sort of fascination, as few would have seen such an eastern-looking city before. We have to remember, of course, that up until 1912, Salonika had been part of the Ottoman Empire for about almost 500 years, so it was very much an eastern-looking city with lots of minarets, etc. And various soldiers say such things as Salonika was a lovely place, a fairy city with white minarets amongst its red roofs, and it was absolutely Arabian Nights come to life, an unsurpassable picture. However, upon landing, the reality of this city quickly presented itself, and Sergeant Ivor Morgan of the 11th Welsh recalled,
"All this enchanting place was destroyed utterly when once we set foot on the ground and marched from the dock to the base camp. For the place absolutely stank. If there was a stronger word, I would have used it."
And Second Lieutenant Cyrus Greenslade of the 10th Devons discovered firsthand just how dirty Salonika was when landing from a motor lighter at the quay.
The water was considerably below the level of the quay, and all baggage had to be thrown up onto the dockside. While this was going on, I saw a man take up a valise, balance it on his head, and try to throw it up onto the quay. It wobbled on the edge and fell with a splash into the water, which those who have not seen at close quarters the harbour of a Middle Eastern port into which all the drainage of the city runs can hardly appreciate. I shouted at him and told him to find the unfortunate owner and tell him what had happened. After fishing it out of the water, he came up and said, "I'm very sorry, sir, but I'm afraid that was your valise." There went all my bedding, all my tobacco and all my comforts for 2 months, and I wondered how I was going to manage.
But Greenslade need not have worried, because the wily traders and merchants of Salonika soon realised what profits could be made, as they had a new captive market who had more money than the usual population of the city. During the campaign, officers from units could come down and grab a spot of leave in the city. However, these chances were often few and far between. And there was a great deal of resentment from men serving up country, where it was a very rough and ready existence, to the men down at the base, so-called base wallers. And Captain Hughes of the 7th Wiltshires recalled the following.
"At the base, they put their men on to building tennis courts and making palatial quarters for officers and men, and spent their nights in the cafe and theatre, giving the world at home the idea that that was the sort of life that the Salonika army was leading, and gaining the name of the Salonika picnic party."
Now, if officers had the chance to slip away from the front line, there was no such option for most of the ordinary other ranks until early in 1918, when a system of base area leave was instituted. And this went some way into making up for the fact that transportation difficulties, I've outlined that in that long journey home across Europe, made it impossible to go home, to send men home in large numbers on leave. Unfortunately, in August 1917, a great fire swept through the heart of Salonika, very much like the Great Fire of London, an accidental fire, but it burnt the heart out of the city. And sadly, this took with it many of the cafes, clubs and cabaret venues that soldiers would have wanted to actually visit when they had the chance. However, although of dubious repute, some of these places did actually re-establish themselves, and they did have an important function for men from the front line, as Captain Turner of the Royal Field Artillery points out.
"They served their purpose in being a sort of safety valve, where fed-up officers and men from the line could blow off a little surplus steam and make hideous noises to really hide their innermost feelings."
But most of the time, British soldiers, British Salonika Force, that's the teeth arms, the men up in the front line, are basically stuck up country for almost the entire campaign. So because men can't come back to Salonika, what do we do to help morale? So men who are out of the line need to be kept busy and basically to be entertained and keep their morale up. So there's lots of sports. The British Army's great at organising sporting competitions. There are football, rugby and cricket teams in brigade, divisional and corps leagues. Friendly matches are played against neighbouring French units, and they can play home internationals because you've got English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish troops there. Athletics meets, horse shows and boxing tournaments are also very popular. But if you're of a less sporting disposition, you can also get involved in amateur dramatics. There's plenty of sort of concert parties there, and 4 of the British divisions actually established theatres a little way behind the front line and put on pantomimes and musical reviews. And the stories of these pantomimes and musical reviews are normally sort of rewritten and skewed towards what's actually happening in the soldier's life in Macedonia. So there's lots of in-jokes for soldiers that would actually know things that are actually serving there. There are also some accounts of field sports taking part without the standard equipment, as you could use Mules bombs and mortar shells for fishing, and some men were actually using Lewis guns for wildfowling and actually saying it was actually training for anti-aircraft fire. It's a good excuse. And one final entertainment for troops was tortoise racing. And to do a tortoise race, what you need is 2 or more tortoises. And the idea is you draw a large circle, you put a stick in the middle of the circle, you put the tortoises heads to the stick, and it's the first tortoise to get himself or herself out of the ring wins. And there was lots of betting, and some of these things could go on for hours and hours because the tortoises turned around or just sat still. And if you had a good racing tortoise, the men would keep it with them with their kit and move around with the tortoise and sort of keep the racing going wherever they were. So that's the sort of entertainment and the arrival. Now, what was it actually like for campaigning? Well, for many of the men, their first experience of campaigning in Macedonia was helping to convert Salonika into an entrenched camp. And the reason for this is that when the Bulgarians pushed us out of Serbia in the end of 1915, we thought they were going to invade Greece. They've actually been told by the Germans to stay on the border, to basically because the Germans do not want Greece coming into the war. But we don't know the Bulgarians are not going to come down after us. So we find that there's a range of foothills about 10 miles north of Salonika. And we entrench this. It's about 70 miles long. The British and French put entrenchments in here. And the reason for this is we need to keep the port of Salonika safe. It's the only place that we can reinforce. It's the only big deep water port. We can reinforce the troops, or we can pull everybody out. But if the Bulgarians get their artillery within range of the port, it's going to be impossible. So we need to build these defences. And they're a chain of mutually supporting strong points connected by communications trenches. And the lavish use of barbed wire led to the British soldier nicknaming it the birdcage. But by April 1916, it's pretty obvious to the Allied commanders that the Bulgarians are not coming down out of the hills. They're still 50 miles away to the north. And it's decided that we can't basically leave a large British and French force just sitting there. So we have to move up country to actually go and find the Bulgarians. So we do a move northward in the summer of 1916. And there is then an Allied offensive which culminates in the capture of the town of Monastir in Serbia, and the Serbs back on their own territory. And that's on the 19th of November 1916, that city is captured. And the front line is then established that changes little until September 1918. But the initial move up country in the summer of 16 was far from easy. Macedonia had very little in the way of a road network before the British and French armies turned up. And Private George Vesey of the 8th Ox and Bucks was just one of thousands of British and French soldiers moving north in the summer of 1916. And this is a quick quote from his memoirs.
Marching is very hot and tiring, and we get a thirst which no amount of water will satisfy. Our water bottles are a very precious thing. Our bottles are filled before moving off, and no man must drink until the order is given, although we get a longing to empty the bottle in one glorious drink. The watermen have difficulty in keeping up with the supply, which has to be carried in leather bags on the mules. We go a long way up the Ceres Road, one of the few decent roads in the country, then branch off. Here a day, there a day. It reminds me of the children of Israel, as each night we pitch our bivouacs and in the morning pack it up and wander on in this wilderness of a country.
By the summer of 1917, the BSF were holding a front of about 90 miles, stretching from the River Vardar in the west round to the mouth of the River Struma to the east. And within this area there are two main operational sectors. Firstly, the tangled mass of hills and ravines above Lake Doiran, and the nature of that terrain lent itself to the defensive, and unfortunately the Bulgarians were there on the high ground. And then we have the Struma Valley, about 30 miles to the east, a flat, almost featureless plain stretching between two range of foothills between 5 and 12 miles apart. So two totally different theatres. If you serve in the Struma or at Doiran, you're only, say, 30 miles away, but you have a totally different experience of that campaign just because of this totally different terrain. Behind the lines, there are corps and divisional headquarters, ammunition and supply dumps, field hospitals, casualty clearing stations, RFC landing grounds, rest camps, training schools, are all put into these old abandoned villages, and places such as Yanesh behind the Doiran front and Lahana in the hills above the Struma Valley become these vital admin centres for the BSF and are known to virtually every member of that force. But the barren nature of the countryside and the destruction of the Balkan Wars meant that virtually all materials for the construction of these camps have to be brought in by ship to Salonika and then shipped up country, either on railways or wagons or 3-ton lorries. So we'll look at Doiran first. This is the major area of operations for the British. And what we have across the Doiran battlefield, some key terrain features. Firstly, we have a hill about 1,800 feet high, which is called the French named it the Grand Coronet, and it has a large observation bunker on the top, which the British call the Devil's Eye. Next to that is a 2,000-foot ridge called Pip Ridge, and it's got a number of peaks or pips, and each of these has a wired-in redoubt with machine guns, trench mortars, and occasionally static flamethrowers. It's only 50 yards wide, so that's your attacking frontage along there if you're trying to push the Bulgarians off the ridge. In the Bulgarian front line, there is a small conical hill called the Petit Coronet. It's a key piece of terrain because if you don't take that hill in any attack, the Bulgarians get enfilade towards the lake and towards Pit Ridge and cut out any attacks trying to come round that hill. And separating the Bulgarian front line and positions such as Petit Coronet from the British front line is the Jumeau ravine, about 450 feet, almost a V-shaped ravine, very, very steep and very narrow at the bottom, a real obstacle between the two opposing lines. The Devil's Eye, it was said in the official history, says that it sort of dominated the British lines and all the country southward towards Salonika. So up there with good, powerful telescopes, the Bulgarians could almost see back into Salonika, but they could certainly see the railheads. So they could see the trains and the supplies coming up. So if there was an offensive being launched, the Bulgarians knew it was coming. There was no secrecy that could actually be put in place there. The only secrecy you had was the exact date that you launched the offensive, but they would see the build-up coming from that position. So, and of course, prior to that advance of the Allied forces in the summer of 1916, the Bulgarians have had 6 months to sit on this position and to work on it 24/7. So, you know, there's nobody firing at them for 6 months, and they've got all that time to build the defences. They blast the trenches from solid rock. They construct dugouts in a similar manner and roof them with solid concrete. The same with dugouts, ammunition stores, observation posts and artillery positions and machine gun posts. They're all constructed to withstand hits by heavy howitzers. Artillery and support weapons have also been sighted for maximum effect. The artillery is ranged in on all possible routes of advance. There is an excellent communication system up there for the Bulgarians. and it all ensures that the maximum firepower can be brought to bear quickly on any enemy attack on that position. Now, along with that, the strength of that position, the British at Doiran are also fighting Bulgaria's elite military formation, the 9th Pleven Division. And these men knew their positions intimately and believed them to be impregnable. There was excellent infantry artillery cooperation. What would happen is that the infantry, if they sent up a signal rocket saying that they were losing the position, the Bulgarian artillery would want their first salvo to land on that position before that rocket or flare hit the ground. And they prided themselves on that sort of cooperation between the different arms. Also, the 9th Division had excellent commanders. General Nerezov initially, and then General Vazov were great tactical commanders. They were also, Vazov especially was a sort of commander who would actually go down, talk to men going into the line, tell them exactly what they were doing, boost their morale. And he would also invite junior officers to his mess for dinner or lunch and discuss with them about their part of the sector of the front and what they could do to improve the defences. Now, given the strength of these Bulgarian positions, not much of the British line was held in strength during daylight, apart from sentry posts and machine gun positions, and the main body of the British infantry would remain in camps, in dugout camps in ravines just behind the front line. And it was only really in places such as Lator 2, which is a hill just across from Petit Coronet, where the trenches were held in greater strength and where concrete was used by the British because that was very heavily shelled sector of the front. On average, an infantry battalion at Doiran would spend 11 days in the front line, followed by about 15 days in reserve or out of the line. However, the great shortage of troops in Salonika means that most infantry spent very long periods of time within Bulgarian artillery range. And the war diary of the 7th Wiltshires records that when they moved back to a training camp at a place called Kalabach on the night of the 3rd to 4th of July 1917, it was the first time the battalion had been out of artillery range for 12 months. But what we have to think about is that the Bulgarians are not, this isn't like Western Front style artillery firing. The Bulgarians have never got that many guns, and they certainly don't have enough ammunition. So there are more quiet days quite often recorded in war diaries than days when there is any real significant fighting. However, the British always had this ethos, as they do on all theatres of war in the First World War, the idea of dominating no man's land, because we don't want the Bulgarians to get complacent and think they're having an easy time. So there were regular patrols and raids sent out. Now, it's quite difficult to move across this ground, and Captain Stukely of the 7th Ox and Bucks outlines these problems thus.
Movement of a formed body across this ground was very difficult, and the maintenance of direction was far from being a simple matter. If the party did get safely across, it had to wriggle up a steep and rocky slope to reach the enemy wire. Consequently, it was very easy for a raid to misfire before it reached its objective, and even if it was successful, the return journey was sure to be very unpleasant, owing to the Bulgar barrage, which was extremely well placed and generally unavoidable.
Now, in contrast to the trench warfare practiced around Doiran by 12th Corps, the men of 16th Corps in the Streamer Valley had a totally different style of operations. It was much more mobile. As here, there's very little in the way of dead ground across the valley floor. And when the British arrived in the area in the summer of 1916, the area is a mixture of marshland, areas of thick scrub, and patchworks of abandoned farmland surrounding small deserted villages. Now, initially, the Struma River, which flows down the middle of the valley, more or less, is a natural barrier between the opposing forces. The Bulgarians don't really try to cross. And the British concentrate their defensive positions a lot around crossing points such as bridges, fords, and they set up a number of ferry points as well. So what we do is we do patrol across, because when there are enemy incursions into the valley, again, we're trying to dominate the area. So we send across patrols of yeomanry and cyclists working in combination. And here, cyclists are actually used offensively as cyclists. They don't cycle and then dump their bicycles and go in as infantry. They actually ford the river carrying their bicycles across their heads and then cycle off along the tracks with the yeomanry working alongside them. The big problem is, of course, this is an agricultural area, and there are lots of standing crops at certain times of the year. So you get maize crops up to 6 to 10 feet high. And Private Francis Ching of the 16th Corps Cyclists took part in many of these raids and remembered the following.
Our job was to patrol these villages to keep them free of Bulgarians. Sometimes they were down in front of us and laid traps for us. Sometimes we were there first and laid traps for them. But very seldom did they catch any of us, and very seldom did we catch any of them. They chased us as much as we chased them. It was fun in a way, I suppose.
Now, there was a change in British sort of strategy in the Struma Valley in October 1916 when the British actually decided to dominate the whole of the valley. And the idea is to push the Bulgarians back into the foothills near the town of Ceres, so really get them out of the valley. And what we then do is we do bite and hold operations, so limited objectives, and the idea is to take 1 or 2 villages at a time. And these operations were anything from a couple of battalions up to a brigade and a half. And then we established an outpost line. And the outpost line worked on pairs of villages. So you had a forward village, probably a mile or so ahead of your main position. And in the forward village, you had 1 company of infantry, along with a couple of Vickers machine guns, a couple of Lewis guns, and perhaps 1 or 2 light pieces of artillery. Then in the rear village, you'd have the rest of the infantry battalion, the rest of the machine gun company, more artillery, engineers and medical services as well. So that was your main base of operations. And the forward village was to be used as a patrol base. And the idea was if the Bulgarians heavily attacked that forward village, you'd fall back onto the main village, and then the whole battalion would defend that position. This isn't a static holding of these villages. This again it's the idea to go out and patrol and to raid. And Second Lieutenant Richard Skilbeck Smith of the 1st Leinsters recalled his first patrol thus.
Armed to the teeth with rifle, bayonet, revolver, spare bandolier and 2 bombs, and accompanied by 10 lusty lads, I proceeded, about 10:30 p.m, to find out what was happening ahead. Before we had got 100 yards from one of our posts, we drew the fire of half the rifles of the Bulgarian 27th Division. They had heard us trampling about in the brittle, dry brushwood and let loose at once. From a great, wide semicircle, as it were, they peppered us for all they were worth, probably in their windy state expecting an attack. But bullets by night find no target as a rule, and we safely repaired back to one of our posts after prowling about for 2 hours.
But it was, of course, much quieter in the Struma Valley, and the Bulgarian troops there weren't up to the same quality as the 9th Pleven Division. And because it was less aggressive down in the Struma, you could spend longer periods of time in the line, and you could hold the line with less troops. So an infantry battalion could spend on average up to 22 days in the front line, because you'd only need 2 companies in at a time. So very, very different from Doiran. Another difference, of course, is that Doiran's very rocky, so you can't dig decent trenches, you have to blast them out of the rock. But here, it's a nice agricultural area, so much like in France, the soil lends itself, the depth of soil lends itself to the digging of trenches. Now, because General Milner's never got enough artillery, manpower and ammunition to fight many large battles, when there is a large battle at Doiran, what they tend to do is to strip out any of the divisional and corps artillery, so the heavier stuff, from the Struma, move it round to Doiran, use it in the Doiran action, and then move it back again. So they do that in 1917 and 1918. And they're successful in that because the Bulgarians aren't particularly enterprising in the Struma Valley and don't really realise that heavy artillery has actually gone. So really the Struma, if you look at it, if you think the Salonika campaign is a sideshow, really for the British, the Struma Valley is the sideshow of the sideshow. But I think in the way for soldiers actually fighting in Doiran, probably it was a more interesting campaign because it was more open and you were doing little raids and attacking villages and patrolling over quite large distances. I think there was more initiative for, say, junior officers and NCOs in the Struma Valley than the more formalised trench warfare at Doiran. And as I've mentioned, this is where the British fight their two main battles, April-May 1917 and in September 1918. And both times these battles are subsidiary to the main offensives. The main offensives in Salonika are always made by the French and the Serbs west of the Vardar River. The attack at Doiran is to tie the maximum number of Bulgarian troops to that position. It's only 11 miles from the Vardar. The idea is we don't want those Bulgarians, especially the 9th Plevin Division, moving westward to reinforce against the French and the Serbians. And the reason for this is that Doiran guards mountain roads and passes back to Bulgaria. So it is an invasion route into Bulgaria. And because you've got the elite troops there with excellent commanders, the idea is that these men have been told that this is the key point on the whole of the front, and as long as they hold that position, Bulgaria is safe. So really, Doiran for the Bulgarians is a bit like Verdun for the French. They are going to chuck blokes into this, they are not going to give it up. And that's why the British have to attack there in 1917 and again in 1918. It's obviously impossible here to give you a full account of these two battles, so what we'll do is we'll give you a few short eyewitness accounts to sort of give you an idea of the intensity of the fighting. Firstly, a description of moving up to join the attack in First Doiran, and this comes from Lieutenant Watts of the 8th Oxen Bucks.
The march to these assembly positions was an inspiring event. The battle was in full progress. The whole battlefront was in view from the high ground of the Hampshire Ridge, across which we passed, and the night was at times almost like day with the incessant use of very-lights by the enemy. The searchlights were constantly playing on our positions from points in the rear of the enemy's lines, and were on several occasions directed straight to us as we advanced across the open. By calling an immediate halt, however, our presence was not detected, and all the companies arrived at their assembly positions with a total loss of only 3 other ranks, wounded by stray bullets.
Next, the typical experience of an infantryman advancing at night during the First Battle of Doiran in 1917, and this is Private Francis Mullins of the 10th Devons, moving through Jumeau Ravine to attack the Bulgarian strongpoint on Petit Coronet.
As soon as it got dark, we moved out of our trenches and down one side of the hill to get to in the lower end of the Jumeau Ravine. Johnny knew we were on the move and our route. They gave us a right pasting. We soon had casualties. They seemed to know our every move. We got so far in the ravine and then it was all hell let loose. Our lads were being knocked over like ninepins. We, that were able, got about halfway. Noise of the explosions were terrific. Suddenly I found myself alone. We had to walk behind each other as it was not very wide. My mates behind and in front were knocked out. One poor chap was calling out for his mother. I was nearly choked with the cordite fumes, but I was unhurt, not even blown over, and my bag of bombs was untouched. I had to go on. I picked my way over the bodies. I could only see by the flash of the explosions.
Next, during the attack of the 8th and 9th of May 1917, is the attack on Petit Coron made by the 7th Oxen Bucks, and this is an account by Private Frederick Webster.
We had to slide down from our positions, like being on a toboggan and with a 20-foot drop at the bottom into a ravine. Then climb up nearly straight before we started. Everybody had his face and hands all blacked. When we were waiting to go over the top, he sent gas shells over, and we had to get our helmets on quick. After it had cleared off, we went over and got nicely up to his wire without many casualties. But then everything came at once. Their trench mortars, grenades, bombs, bullets, everything. Well, we cleared them out of the first trenches. As I was flinging a bomb into a dugout, where there were 6 of them, I got a lump of Johnny's bomb in my knee. I flung all my 4 bombs into this dugout, and wasn't there a scuffle. I never heard any more of them after. Well, we advanced a bit further and got them out of the second trench, but it was too hot there, and our men were dropping by the dozen. Our sergeant was killed, and there was 1 corporal left in our platoon. Next morning, no men at all killed or wounded, but we held the position for 6 hours.
And finally, Chaplain Henry Day, who went forward with the 7th Royal Berkshires, who were actually in support of the 7th Oxen Bucks, and he describes the scene in the Jumeau and then on Petit Coronet.
There was a steady flow of wounded returning from the attack, and for the next 4 or 5 hours I was kept busy attending to them. Much of my work consisted in helping the disabled on their way back across the Jubo or up to Tor Ravine to our trenches. Here, medical orderlies and stretcher bearers were in readiness to give them attention. About 10 o'clock, I thought I would like to see what was happening at the scene of action. So I pushed up to Le Petit Coronet, and there I witnessed an indescribably gruesome sight. Lying and sitting in all kinds of positions were rows upon rows of dead and dying. Many of the wounded were horribly mangled. Some were obliviously insensible to pain, while others were suffering agonies.
Now we have to remember that the men, or most of the men, attacking in September 1918 in that second battle were the same men who had done this in 1917. So they'd survived the attack in 1917. They knew the Bulgarians had then used that battle to work out where the weak points of their defences were, and they had another year to improve those positions. So in the second battle, they had little illusion about what was actually coming. And we have an account here from Major Christopher Hughes, who was on the 77th Brigade staff, and he went forward in the early hours of the 19th of September 1918 to check in with the battalion commanders in his brigade and to talk to one of the, and this is his account of meeting one of the officers, and it's obvious from the reaction of this officer that he knew what was coming that day.
It was an unpleasant walk. The Flodaja ravine was being shelled with salvos of 5.9s, and it was thick with dust and smoke. After seeing the Argylls and the Fusiliers, I then had to find the Scottish Rifles, and discovered them assembling ready to move out to the attack, and saw Scougal, their commander. He said, "Goodbye, Hughes, we shan't meet again." He was killed leading the battalion very soon after. He was a splendid chap.
So if we look at casualties in those two battles at Doiran, so that's just 4 days worth of fighting. The casualties for the British were 8,179 officers and men, and that is 35% of the total British battle casualties in the Salonika campaign. And in fact, if we look at the 7th Ox and Bucks in particular, the 24 hours of the 8th and 9th of May 1917 were their most costly of the whole of the First World War. They went into action on the 8th of May with 16 officers and 530 men. Casualties suffered 15 officers and 456 men. The 7th Royal Berkshires, who were in reserve, lost 9 officers and 154 men. And in fact, after the war, Wheeler, who was the commanding officer of that 7th Ox and Bucks, actually wanted to put a memorial on top of Petit Coronet, but he was talked out of it by General Milne, and the money went into the main Doiran Memorial. So that's the fighting. But what else did the troops have to put up with in Macedonia? Well, what about the climate? Well, the winter and summer bring extremes of temperature, and it made life for those men up country pretty difficult. Only during the brief periods of spring and autumn could life say to be anything but pleasant. But of course, these were the 2 short periods of the windows of opportunity for most of the military operations. You get temperatures up to 112 Fahrenheit in the shade, and the heat prevented anything but essential work being done between sort of 1300 and 1600 hours during the day. Training programs and fatigues would work around that, starting early in the morning and finishing at lunchtime, and then starting up again late afternoon and running into the evening. During that enforced rest period, men would remain under canvas or under whatever shade could be found. And in this way, whole camps could appear deserted, as Private Charles Packer of the 26th Divisional Ammunition Column describes.
A stranger strolling through our lines during these hours would probably not meet a soul, but he would hear snores coming from some of the bivouacs. From others he would hear low mutterings of satisfaction as some fellow, jackknife in hand, investigated the seams of his shirt in search of lice.
And of course, summer afternoons not only provided a welcome, they didn't really provide a welcome break from the rigours of campaigning, because not only was it bakingly hot, but of course the local insect population came out and made life pretty much of a misery. Gunner Ivor Davies relates about the insects.
Mosquitoes and flies were numerous. At times they made life a misery. Eating a biscuit and jam was a work of art. Unless one continually waved a hand over the biscuit, it would be black with flies. If one placed an empty jam can on the ground, it was immediately filled with flies. The ants also fought for their share. Hundreds of large black beetles also put in an appearance. Huge fellows, 3 to 4 inches long, with height and breadth to match.
And of course that hot summer weather could also affect those staples of army rations.
You could pour your bully beef out of a tin like a thick congealed mass, and it would be swarming with flies in the short journey from mess tin to mouth. And it was as well sometimes not to think too much of home, when bread was being emptied from old sacks which had been rubbing on the sides of perspiring mules for an hour or two on their journey from the dump.
Water was also another problem. It was limited. Most men were limited to a pint of water a day. There were lots of lakes in the area, but that water was not fit for consumption, only for animal consumption, not for men. So the Royal Engineers had to spend a lot of time sinking wells, tapping natural springs and laying pipelines towards the front line. In more forward areas, troops had to be content with fetching water from centrally located water tanks, and it was a job of battalion pack mule sections to maintain the supply of water in these tanks. And they would go down to the water collection points at night and then carry the water back to these tanks under cover of darkness. So that's summer. What about the contrasting winter? Well, the 10th Irish Division, who come from Gallipoli in October 1915, go into the worst weather of the campaign in November, December 1915. They come from Mudros. They haven't been properly re-equipped. Many of the soldiers head into the Serbian mountains wearing khaki drill uniforms, many of them without greatcoats. And the problems soon become apparent, as Private William Knott of the 32nd Field Ambulance recorded in his diary.
It is the coldest atmosphere I've ever experienced, and the infantry are piling in by the score. Poor fellows, with frostbite and jaundice from the bleak perishing blizzard, welcomed the big roaring fires we kept on the go. I spent nearly all day dishing out cocoa, for as soon as one crowd finished, another batch would come in. Some were absolutely helpless, others their overcoats frozen to their necks, while one had an icicle hanging from his nose.
And by early December 1915, this is before the Bulgarians even attack 10th Irish Division at Costarino, they have to evacuate 23 officers, 1,663 men are invalided to Salonika suffering from frostbite. So they've lost a battalion and a half of men before the Bulgarians even fight them. Captain Cedric Selverson of the 7th Fox and Bucks remembers of the trenches near Doldzeli in February 1917.
The heavy flaky snow of the morning turned into a blizzard of very fine, dry snow. By dusk, most of our trenches were absolutely impassable. It had been impossible to work at them during the day, and although every possible man was sent up to the trenches to work by night, it was a hopeless task. Nature filled again faster than man could empty. The best that could be done by the sentries was to keep one fire bay clear by constantly moving up and down. Bartlett tried to patrol, but the drifts made progress impossible.
And we have to remember that the soldiers are primarily living in bivouacs, bell tents or dugouts at this time. If you're very, very lucky if you've got a hut with a stove in it. Obviously down in the Streamer Valley in the winter the river floods, so it floods the trenches out, floods your dugouts, and both sides were affected at that time. So both sides would just find patches of high ground. And of course, during the winter, you've also got the resupply problem. The roads of Macedonia are pretty poor. Even the Ceres road, which is one of the very good roads, the metalled surface is pretty poor, and it's made for horse transport and mule transport. It wasn't made to have 3-ton trucks going up and down it every day of the week. And it just disintegrates during the winter. And at that time, the army is dependent on mule transport. You get mules dragging wooden sledges behind them. And it's really down to the fact that we've got pack mule transport for all of the frontline formations that the British Army in Salonika is actually mobile and resupplied, especially during the winter. Now, with the summer came what is really the blight of the Salonika campaign, and perhaps the biggest enemy, a bigger enemy than the Bulgarians, and that was disease, in particular malaria. And if we look at non-battle casualties in Salonika, the total non-battle casualties for the British Salonika force are 481,262. So that's obviously the army is only about half that size. So what the British Army do is every time you go to hospital, you're counted again. So that's countless men, the same man going through the system a lot of times. That figure, of course, is 20 times the level of the battle casualties. So this is a very old-fashioned kind of military campaign. It's more akin to, say, like the Crimean War, where more people are likely to go down with something nasty than you are to actually get shot by or wounded by the enemy. And of that 481,000 non-battle casualties, 162,517 are malaria cases. And by late 1917, the British medical force in Salonika has 50,000 hospital beds, and by 1918, 29,000 of those are occupied by chronic malaria sufferers. And because of the U-boat threat, we can't evacuate them. We can't send them to Malta, we can't send them to Egypt, we can't send them to the UK. They're stuck in Greece. The army did try some preventative measures to combat mosquito and malaria. Firstly, quinine was the first line of defence, and Private Francis Ching recalled the following of the routine associated with taking it.
You had to take quinine on the tongue, not in a tablet. You paraded for quinine once or twice a day. You went in front of the Sergeant Major, who was in charge of the quinine powder. You'd put your tongue out. You'd have a little spoon and would dig into this can of quinine and place a small spoonful on the tip of your tongue. Then you'd be ordered to drink from your mug of water and swallow.
They also brought in some anti-malarial or anti-mosquito clothing used by sentries and other people of the soldiers on night duty. And an excellent description of this kit is provided by Second Lieutenant Richard Skilbeck Smith.
Any stranger seeing a soldier dressed up in anti-mosquito garb would for the first time imagine himself face to face with a scarecrow. The face and arms are thoroughly smeared with an anti-mosquito preparation called paraquat, an excellent thing while it lasts, but its tendency is, of course, to get absorbed into the skin after an hour or two, and one had to smear on a second coating. The mosquitoes didn't like it though, and always kept very clear of the paraquat face. I can recommend it to any young lady worried about an overzealous admirer.
Now, there was also lots of anti-mosquito work to try to tackle the problem at source. But it's very difficult to gauge the success of this anti-malaria campaign. So really it's saying, well, they're pretty much wasting their time. But I think on a morale level, you actually think, at least if you're getting the guys out there doing stuff, it's actually going to work. So in a way, that was one reason for actually doing that work. But malaria remains a problem. So in conclusion, we have to think that Salonika is really a forgotten campaign, and 3 years fighting in one of Europe's most unhealthy environments with little support from the War Office led to the stagnation and gradual decline of the British Salonika force. General Milne fought hard to alleviate matters, especially with regard to the welfare of his men, but so often the army had to rely on its own very inadequate resources. But out of this grew very strong bonds of comradeship, and these found expression in the formation of the Salonika Reunion Association in 1924. And these were the veterans of the BSF, and one can perhaps draw a parallel here with the Burma veterans of the Second World War. Both sets of men believed they had fought in a forgotten campaign and had never had their due recognition for their achievements. So it's fitting in a way to conclude with the words of the Bishop of London's open letter to the Times, published on the 8th of November 1918, and it stands as an epitaph, a fitting epitaph to the BSF, and it says, "These men of our eastern armies have had the dust and toil without the laurel of the race to victory." Thank you.
The question and answer session will start shortly. Please log in to ask a question.
Hello again and welcome back after Alan's talk. Alan, I hope you're with us as well. I think that was a pretty graphic description of what the campaign must have been like. And we're very grateful to you, Alan, for putting so much into this and painting the picture so realistically. We have no questions, we've got one just about to come in. Ted Evely, this is good. Alan, a wonderful talk with amazing accounts, thank you. Was any help provided from Cyprus, Egypt or India? That's an interesting one.
Yes, there were 2 Indian mule transport units there from the start of the campaign. There were also Indian muleteers with, I think, 2 or 3 mountain artillery batteries. And most of the survey work for trench mapping from 1917 was done by surveyors from the Survey of India. And in 1918, they were going to Indianize the whole of the campaign, just as they'd done in Palestine. But the Bulgarians surrendered before the Indian troops arrived. So the Indian troops arrived in October 1918 and ended up sitting around in camps just outside Salonika, freezing in the winter, and unfortunately many of them caught pneumonia. And there is an Indian military cemetery there, but all of those chaps unfortunately died after the fighting. From Cyprus, they raised what was known as the Macedonian Mule Corps, and they were Cypriot muleteers who volunteered and then served under British Army regulations, and again they very much like the Indian mule transport kept men supplied in the front lines.
Excellent, thank you very much, and thank you very much for that, Ted. If you're interested in asking a question, there's a page at the bottom, or a little box at the bottom of your screen for you to open the chat, and you can take it from there. Henry Spielberg has asked a question. Henry's one of our trustees. Alan, why has the campaign, in your views, received such little attention over the decades?
Well, I think it probably goes back to the First World War in itself, in that this wasn't a campaign the British ever wanted to fight. We put very little resource into it in comparison to the whole of the First World War. If you look at the British Army now, it's a pretty huge commitment, but then it was pretty small scale. And also it was sort of denigrated that there wasn't any proper fighting going on and these chaps were just sitting around not actually doing anything. And that sort of story sort of took hold. And we've got to remember that the Western Front was absolutely massive, and most British soldiers fought on the Western Front. And if we look at what we remember now about the First World War, for Britain, it's primarily the Western Front, bit of Gallipoli. But even if you look at the Western Front, really all the wider British public remember is really 1916, 1917. So it's not surprising really that something like Salonika, which wasn't in the public conscious as much during the First World War, has totally drifted away subsequently.
His second question, actually, a sort of follow-on, was if you could indicate one particular area of it which should receive greater awareness, better knowledge about it, what would that be, do you think?
I just think the whole point that it actually existed, and there were 228,000 British soldiers there, and the fact that it's a totally different war to what people think the First World War for British soldiers is all about, which at the end of the day is trenches, mud, blood, and people getting mowed down by machine gun fire. And that is actually a wrong view of the Western Front anyway, but that is what people think the whole of the First World War for British soldiers was like. So this is a totally different view, and it shows that not everybody was in France and Flanders during World War I. It was a world war after all, and British soldiers were all over the place. And Salonika is just one of those places that many British soldiers who, like my great uncle, joined up to fight the Germans in France and ended up fighting Bulgarians in Greece. I mean, he didn't sign up for that, but soldiers go where they're told.
Exactly. We've got a question about Milne, actually, General George Milne, from Tim Jones, who says that he was not only fighting the Bulgars, and determined they were, and he was also fighting resistance from the War Office to supply him properly, but he was also fighting a very difficult campaign. He must have been quite a man, this.
Yeah, he seems to have been somebody who was very good at organisation, administration, sort of running a campaign on a shoestring. He also had to be a bit of a political operator, because you've got to remember the British are part of a six-nation coalition in the Salonika campaign, and were under overall French command as well. And I think Milne was very good at sort of smoothing the waters and playing that sort of very sort of political game. Let's face it, he had to deal with General Sarai to start off with. He was one of the most political generals in the French army. And I think this is why I think the experiences Milne got in Salonika, where it's not just the military side of things, it's the politics, diplomacy, stood him in good stead for when he becomes Chief of the Imperial General Staff after the war. And he spends quite a long period, I think like late 20s, early 30s as CIGS. And I think Salonika started him off. He was very popular with the British soldiers. They nicknamed him Uncle George. And he was always trying to do stuff for their welfare. And post-war, in 1924, I think it is, the Salonika Reunion Association, which is a veterans group just for British Salonika veterans, starts up, and Milne is the patron until his death in 1948. And he attends, I think, all but two of the annual musters that took place every year on the Horse Guards Parade. So he was really committed to supporting the veterans of his campaign.
Excellent. I've got a question here from Simon James Kirkbride. My grandfather, he says, was a lieutenant in the Nottinghamshire Yeomanry, the Notts Yeomanry. Are you aware of them or other similar units and their participation?
Yes, there was a brigade of yeomanry there, 7th Mounted Brigade. The Nottinghamshires were there, the Surrey Yeomanry, Derbyshire Yeomanry as well. Their main job, when the birdcage line was built, the yeomanry were actually patrolling almost up to where Doiran is, just to check if the Bulgarians were not coming into Greece. And there were some clashes with German cavalry early on. The yeomanry were also doing reconnaissance and sort of intelligence gathering. They knew that the Allied forces would have to move up country at some point. So in the months before they moved into, say, the Struma Valley, the yeomanry were going up and looking at the villages, and then they were going in and getting intelligence information on the villages, as in what nationality are the people there? Are they friendly? Who's the headman? What resources have they got in the village? So all of that intelligence gathering was being done and then sent back to the headquarters. So the yeomanry were playing quite an important game there. And then, as I mentioned in the talk, they did a lot of this patrol work down in the Struma Valley in particular. And then right at the end of the campaign, when we're pursuing the Bulgarians through the mountains back into Bulgaria, it's actually the Derbyshire Yeomanry who are out front, and they are the first people to see the Bulgarian armistice party coming down the road in their two staff cars with the white flags. So the yeomanry are definitely there and playing an important role. In 1917, they get cut down, the number of yeomanry, and some of them go off to Palestine along with 10th Irish Division.
Sounds to me, Simon, and thank you very much for your question there, that there's a good bit of research you could do about your own family there. Mark Taylor has asked Alan, great talk. My grandfather served in Salonika at the Doiran front with the 7th Ox and Bucks and received the military medal in the autumn of 1916. How can I find out more information about why he received the military medal?
Yeah.
Well, that's as easy for us to answer in the museum as for Alan to answer, but you need to make an inquiry, Mark, through the museum to find out more about your grandfather's service in Salonika, and you'll get actually a very good synopsis, a breakdown of all that the unit was doing for the time it was there, for the time that he was serving in it. And you can also research the military medal, which I hope you have in the family, and find out what it was that he did to earn it. Alan, do you want to add anything to that about people researching their families?
Yeah, just that the obviously a good place to start is with the battalion war diary. The big problem with that is that unless you were an officer or won a gallantry award, if you're another rank, you don't get mentioned by name. Well, not normally anyway. But the war diary would give you an idea where they were, particular dates, what they were doing, and that sort of information. The other thing with the Ox and Bucks, 7th Ox and Bucks, is they did write their own battalion history, which I think is very rare for a service battalion. And this memorial record of the 7th Service Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, and it was all the chapters are written by different officers, and the book, I believe, was produced by Blackwell's, and it was paid for by subscription by members of the battalion. And if you paid a bit extra, you've got a really nice page with your own personal war service history in nice calligraphy in the front. The volume I've got hasn't got that. So obviously the person who bought this particular volume was a bit tight with his money. And, well, he was from Scotland. But so this doesn't have it, but I have seen them with the guy's photograph, really nice calligraphy, where he joined up, where he fought, if he was wounded, if he won any medals, and when he was discharged. So those volumes are out there as well. It's a brilliant book. And in fact, 7th Ox and Bucks, there's a lot of information. They're one of the battalions that has the most material available written. There's at least 3-4 diaries at Imperial War Museum, National Army Museum, and 2 or 3 photograph collections as well. So for a single battalion or a single unit in a campaign, they're probably the most, well, they're either the most prolific writers in the whole army, or they're just lucky in that their material survived and has made its way into public archives.
My distinct impression, having read some of the chronicles from that time, which is the regimental story, if you like, during the months of the war, the campaign there, is that officers were encouraged to write their story, their experiences down very soon after they occurred, after the experience. And in a way, I think they would have found that quite quite therapeutic in trying to come to terms with what they'd seen. Because as you've heard, there were some pretty ghastly scenes to be witnessed here. But they write very well, I find, in the chronicles. And those chronicle stories are part of the book that Alan's referred to, which is the 7th Battalion's war story, really, in that campaign. A most unusual volume, and excellent, in fact. I've got a question from Mike here, saying, great talk, thank you very much. How did the French and the Serbians cope with the conditions by comparison with the British? Do you have anything on that?
Yes, I mean, their terrain, I mean, I went there in September with a tour group from the Salonika Campaign Society, and we actually climbed Kajmachalan Mountain, which the Serbians fought their way over in 1916, September 1916, 8,000 feet high. This mountain, there's a ski lodge near the top of it, which now you can go to you can drive up to. Then you walk up the last. It's probably in terms of meters, it's about 500 meters, and it's basically about 3.5 kilometer walk. But it's more mountainous, so it was a hell of a lot colder than some of the British sectors. Less malaria, although there were some lakes down in the valleys, so they still did have the malaria problem, but not as severe as the 16th Corps and the Struma. So it's very, very different terrain that they're fighting over. So they've got different problems. But again, it was still very much very limited in terms of accommodation for troops, and very limited in terms of logistical support. The British actually supplied the Serbians with motor transport support, which was about 300 3-ton lorries and about 1,000 Model T Ford vans, and these things went up and down unmetalled mountain tracks until they fell apart, basically. And then and there was no real workshop facilities, and the guys had to rebuild these lorries from whatever parts they could find. So again, it was pretty rough and ready, but sort of different conditions for the French and Serbs.
Alan, you mentioned malaria just then, and we've got a question about malaria here from Jane. She asks about she comments that the malaria issue was a major effect on numbers available to the British forces at any one time. And also there was considerable confusion in the counting of these casualties. How did the British address the manpower crisis that arose because of the malaria crisis?
Yeah, there's about 158,000 malaria cases and 481,000 non-battle casualties. So that's 20 times the level of people who were, stopped a Bulgarian bullet or shrapnel ball or shell fragment. So it's very much an old school style campaign. And of course, with the British medical system, the reason that that casualty rate is twice the number of the complete British army in Greece is down to the fact that every time a man went to hospital, he was counted. So somebody going down with recurrent malaria may go through the hospital 3 or 4 times. So he is counted 4 times as he goes through. So that's the reason why there's really vast casualty figures. What they had to do is that from 1917, Milne knew that he was going to get no reinforcements in terms of new divisions or even brigades coming out. He was only going to get drafts coming in, and those drafts were normally not enough to fill all the spaces of people who dropped out. So he got special dispensation in late 1916 to form a brigade from garrison battalions. Now, garrison battalions are normally men not fit enough to be in the front line. They're old soldiers or people who've got injuries, so they're not A-class men, and they're normally guarding depots, dumps, POW camps behind the lines. But he got permission to make a brigade of 6 of these battalions and use them on quiet parts of the line, so that proper soldiers, in inverted commas, could be moved to more active areas. And it was numbered the 228th Brigade, which the rest of the army nicknamed the Too Late Brigade because the guys couldn't march very fast anywhere. So it was a bit of an issue. But these guys, because a lot of them are old soldiers and have probably served in India or Egypt, etc., pre-war, they didn't go down with malaria and various other diseases and problems as much as the other soldiers. And it was probably because they probably had some immunity to it from long service in the British Army in some unhealthy parts of the empire, let's say. To try to cut down on the malaria problem, they tried to eradicate malarial breeding grounds, so straightening watercourses, cutting or burning reed beds, draining lakes, and even there were sanitary squads in each battalion or each unit which policed timings. There were set timings for when your mosquito nets in your bivvy tent or whatever had to be down and when it had to be up. And if you missed those timings, you could basically put on a charge. And even leaving an empty can where it could collect water was again another thing to be frowned on. So they were really hot on trying to eradicate malaria, but the problem was just so vast. The army didn't have the resources to do it. And it was only in the 1930s when the Greeks got in American civil engineers that they actually managed to get rid of malaria in that part of Greece.
Alan, thank you for that. I'm going to take a 1-minute pause now just to remind people about the fact that we would be most grateful, please, for any donations you can make to the museum as you listen to our talks and the question and answer session which follows them. We are entirely publicly funded. We have no, or we are entirely privately funded, I say. We have no public funding. We have no government support at all. So everything that we raise or everything we use has to be raised by us. And so these talks are hopefully attractive to people. We're coming right into your living room with you, and so making it nice and easy for you. So I do hope you'll be generous in your support for the museum tonight. And thank you very much indeed for watching tonight and for donating. Alan, back to a question from Keith Fisher. Now, Keith Fisher, I think, if this is the same man, I bet it is one of our voiceovers. Keith, thank you very much for your help tonight. His question is about the strategic importance and the outcome of the campaign.
Yeah, well, it varies because, I mean, as I said early on, that the initial rationale is to stop the Bulgarians coming into the war. When that fails, the British go, right, okay, time to leave. but everybody else wants to stay in because obviously Serbia wants to liberate its territory. The Russians are interested in that. The French have economic links there. The Italians basically want to get hold of Albania and annex it. And there's also this idea of that some people like Lloyd George pick up in the fact it's a possible invasion route to Germany through the back door. So we are trying to bring the Romanians into the war. We're trying to keep Greece neutral or push her to come in on the Allied side. The Romanians have got a 400,000 man army. We want them to attack Austria-Hungary through Transylvania. Then if Austria-Hungary collapses, we can advance up through into southern Germany and invade Germany from the south. I mean, what that actually misses is the fact that, again, the whole logistical structure, it would have been absolutely impossible to do that in any logical time frame to make it strategically viable. But it's all down to it being a coalition and other nations having a lot more stake in the Balkans than we do. And of course, on the counter to that, the British get more and more involved in the Middle East, securing the oil fields in Mesopotamia, trying to get hold of areas into Palestine, etc. So it's a trade-off as well. As you know, the British are doing this, and they need French support, or the French okay to do. So again, we need to go along with the campaign in Salonika. So the rationale is always changing. Sometimes it's seen as important for the British. After the failure at Doiran in 1917 and that spring offensive fails, even Lloyd George takes his eye off Salonika and looks at Palestine as the place to go. But there's always some rationale for keeping the forces there. But we're always trying to find ways to cut that manpower link down with Salonika. But we can never do it enough so we can totally pull out.
Keith, I hope that answers your question. I've got a question here, Alan, from Chris Roger. Thank you, he says. I really enjoyed the talk and learned a lot. My question is, did the Russians ever open up a second front in Bulgaria?
No. The Russians have 2 brigades at Salonika, 2 infantry brigades. They arrived, there were 2 infantry brigades, I think, sent to France and 2 to Salonika. No artillery. That had to be supplied by British and French. Similarly, logistics. And the Russians arrive in the summer of 1916 and stay as a fighting force until the revolution. What then happens is that most of the Russian soldiers refuse to fight under their officers, and they're then basically they have to go through a selection process. So some of the Russians who are still seen as solid and potentially people who are able to fight get the chance to join the French or the Serbian army. The rest of the Russians are made into labour units, and the real hardline Bolshevik Russians are sent to French North Africa until about 1919, when they're then sent back to Russia. But the Russian officers have then nothing to do and normally end up hanging around in bars and clubs in Salonika getting drunk and causing a lot of mayhem. And until sort of the Russian Civil War, when some of them go off and join the White Forces. There's no second front attacking Bulgaria, but of course there are Russian troops in what's left of Romania after Romania collapses very quickly at the end of 1916. There's a small enclave in the north of Romania which hangs on, and it hangs on with Russian support. So that's the closest the Russians get to fighting in Bulgaria, but they are used as shock troops in 1916 alongside the French and the Serbians.
Good. Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got another question here from Chris Howard this time. His grandfather was in the DCLI in Salonika, but they haven't digitalized their war diary yet. He wants to know how he can get some more information on this.
Yeah, it's difficult because I think, does he know which battalion? Because there were 2. There was the 2nd and the 8th. The 2nd are down in the Struma, and the 8th are up at Doiran.
I think Chris is going to have to talk to the museum down in Bodmin, isn't he?
Yeah, they do have some papers. I mean, the other thing to do, of course, is he could also, if he hasn't done already, he could join the Salonika Campaign Society, of which I'm chairman, because we do have members who may already have an interest in either of those battalions, and we do have like an information. You can ask questions, and we can post them either on the website or in the journal. So it's a way of getting information around. There are a couple of personal accounts in the Imperial War Museum of guys in the 8th Battalion DCLI. There's very little that I've found for the 2nd Battalion who were in the streamer.
Okay, thank you very much for that. John Newt makes an observation here. His father, he says, was a sergeant in the RAMC, 78th Field Ambulance throughout the campaign, and was awarded the Meritorious Medal. Now, I think that's probably an MM by the sound of it, on demobilization in 1919. Is there any way to find out what earned the award? He claimed that it was for drinking rum. It probably wasn't, John, for drinking rum. But I expect you should start your inquiries by talking to the RAMC Museum in Keogh Barracks in Aldershot. I think that's where it is, isn't it, Alan?
Yes, unless they've moved it, because it is now is it the Army of Military Medicine now? It's sort of amalgamated with the Corps and whatever. But it is, but you'll find it online anyway if you search under that. The other thing again is it might be worth checking the unit war diary, because occasionally they do write up citations. The problem with the MM, if it is a military medal, the problem with the MM is there is no full list of citations that survives for First World War MMs. It's very hit and miss, unfortunately, but some of the war diaries will actually write them up.
Even though we can't, John, give you a definitive answer on a thing like that really here, I hope this has piqued your interest in this, and you can research your family a bit more following on from here. I think we'll draw things to a close now, Alan, and thank you very much indeed. And thank all our viewers and thank all our questioners for their very helpful and excellent questions, which Alan has been at pains to answer. We're very grateful to you, and we'll so end the evening here. But before we do that, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping and a few thanks around the place. Particular thanks to Clive Smith, who is our excellent filmmaker and film editor, and to the Army Flying Museum, who introduced us actually to Clive, and with whom we partner on some of these talks. The talk that you've just heard and the question and answer session will be available as a recording from tomorrow, I'm pretty hopeful. So if you want to follow it up, go to the Sopho Museum website and you can get the recorded talk there. To our sponsor, EP Barras Limited, I'd like to thank them most sincerely for their generous sponsorship and support for tonight, and say how grateful we are again to them, and to all of you for your generous donations. I don't know what they are yet, but I'm getting very excited at the thought of how generous these donations are, and hope you've enjoyed the talk tonight and felt able to donate to the museum, because we really do need your help. During the talk, you'll have been aware that we had a number of excellent voiceovers, and those voiceovers painted really a lot of Alan's story very nicely to help paint the story for him by giving you voices which told of direct personal experiences. And the voiceover chaps I want to thank very much indeed are Simon Theobalds, Keith Fisher, Paul Redgrave, and Will Innes. Thank you all very much indeed for that. Alan, to you, our speaker, I'm most grateful to you for all the effort you've put into our talk tonight. It's been splendid and we've really enjoyed it. And everyone's, I think, learned a tremendous amount about this largely forgotten campaign. We in the museum would like to present you, Alan, with this. That was a bit of a thump. It is quite a weighty thing, this. It's Simon Harris's History of the 52nd in the Great War. It's a modern history, only completed about 20 years ago, but it's beautifully written, beautifully researched, beautifully illustrated, and I think it's a pattern for modern military histories of long ago campaigns. So we'll get that in the post to you, and I hope you enjoy that. And maybe as you read it, Alan, you'll get a few ideas about other campaigns to look at or other stories to tell in the future.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, David. It's been great to support the museum and to get the Salonika story out there to hopefully a wider audience.
Absolutely. You might like to hold up your book, Alan.
If you want a good, if you haven't bought it already, you should have done. So this is a campaign from the ground up. So this is a soldier's level view of the campaign. Alan Palmer's book, The Gardeners of Salonika, is the book from sort of politics and diplomacy down. So if you want the soldier's eye view, it's very much this one. And of course, if you join the society, you can always visit the battlefields with me. David came out a few years ago, and it's a fantastic place to go. You've seen some of the photographs tonight, and it still looks exactly the same.
It's a remarkable place to visit, actually, and you can hardly move for tripping over military hardware from 100 years ago, which is an astonishing thought. Yeah. We're talking about books for a second, and this is the last mention of a book, and I'm sliding this towards me. This is the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry Regimental History, 1741 to 1966, in 2 volumes, produced as a great magnum opus by George Elliott, a retired officer of the regiment. It's a splendid record and has received remarkable reviews. It's only just been published. And for those of you who are developing a serious interest in your county regiment, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, you could do a lot worse than invest in a copy of in these 2 volumes, because you'll find it absolutely remarkable, and it's been beautifully done. And George, a shout out for you. Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations on your success with it. I look forward to next time on the 23rd of November, a Thursday. Colonel Brian Robertson, a Royal Army Medical Corps officer, retired now, is going to talk to us about ambulance trains. This might be an esoteric subject for some people, but in the hands of Brian Robertson, I can show you it'll be absolutely riveting. Brian was for a long time the commander of the last ambulance train we had in the British Army, and his story is a compelling one and worth looking in on, because you need to remember that an awful lot of our casualties, the regiment's casualties, the great war casualties, quite apart from the Second World War casualties, would have travelled by train. And that is why we felt that this was worth a talk tonight, not tonight, but in a month's time. And I hope you'll remember that date and join us for that on the 23rd of November. Thank you very much indeed in the meantime for joining us, for your generosity. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. In the meantime, good night.